Namo Buddhaya. Good evening. Welcome to the Buddha Dharma TV. I'm Lisa Chu. Today, we begin our program as usual with the blessing service of Dhammakaya Temple in Bangkok, Thailand. This is the final and part 7 of the chanting. To have desired calmness, please listen to the chanting mindfully. Let's calmly listen to it.
มหาการุณิโกนา
นาโถหิตายะสัพพปานินางปุเรตวาปารมีสัพพาปัตโตสัมโพธิมุตตมังเอเตนะสัจวัชเชนะโหตุเตชยมังคลังชยันโตโพธิยามูเลสักยานังนันติวัตโนเอวังตวังวิชโยโหหิชยาสุชยมังคะเลอปราชิตปัลลังเกสีเสปัทวิโปคะเลอภิเสเกสัพพุทธานังอาคาปัตโตปโมทติสุนาคาตังสุมังคลังสุปาพาตังสุโหติตังสุขโนสุมุโหโตจะสุยิทังพรหมจาริสุปทาคินังกายกรรมังวาจากรรมังปทากินังปทากินังมโนกรรมังปณิทิเตปทากินาปทากินานิกตวานลปันตาเตปทากิเนภวัตุสัพพมังคลังราคันตุสัพพเทวตาสัพพพุทธานุภาเวนัสทธาโสธีภวันตุเตภวตุสัพพมังคลังราคันตุสัพพเทวตาสัพพธรรมานุภาเวนัสทธาโสธีภวันตุเตภวตุสัพพมังคลังราคันตุสัพพเทวตาสัพพสังฆานุภาเวนัสทธาโสธีภวันตุเต
Kindly join us for our upcoming insightful talk with the renowned Venerable Dr. Bhante Punnaji. Bhante's insights are both enlightening and rationally sound, demanding your full attention to understand the deep profoundness of his Dharma discourse. Don't miss the opportunity as Dr. Bhante Punnaji illuminates the rare and Buddhist psychological topic, behavior.
So last time we were talking about devotion, but devotion means that we are devotion to something, we are devoted to something. What is that? We are devoted to a goal. It's a goal orientation. Now if you want to pass some examination or something, you are devoted to your studies because you want to attain that goal. The goal is that what you want to attain. Now, last time we said that the goal of the human being is to reach that state of perfection, and that is represented by the Buddha. So when we are thinking of the goal, or in other theistic religions, the goal is God, because all religions are ultimately trying to unite with God. So God becomes the goal. And for the Buddhist, the God is the Buddha. Because that God is the humanistic God. I said, Brahma Bhuto. Brahma means God. Bhuto means become, God become. So when we speak of the Buddha, we are speaking of the human being becoming God. That is the humanistic religion. So that means the Buddha becomes the goal. So the goal that we are trying to reach is the Buddha. Buddha represents that goal. And we believe that it is possible for a human being to reach that state of perfection. Now, from the Christian point of view, the human being is a sinner. And the human being can never become God. Even when they talk about uniting with God, it only means that the human being can go to heaven and be in front of God. God is still separate from the human being. So that is the theistic way of thinking. But in this humanistic way of thinking, which is Buddhism, the human being can become God. That is the most important thing to understand. And so, the practice of religion is to gradually approach towards that goal by perfecting yourself. And the first step in that process of becoming perfect is, of course, being devoted to the Buddha, the worship of the Buddha. We don't pray to the Buddha. This is very important to understand. Buddhists don't pray to anyone. Pray means asking for help. We are not asking for help. We worship the Buddha, which means we recognize the worth of what the Buddha achieved. That is worshipping the Buddha. Worship means worship. So that we are recognizing the worth of the Buddha. So when we talk about the Buddha, we are not just talking about the body of the Buddha. The important thing is the mind of the Buddha. Now, the Christians speak of Jesus as God become man. God has become man. Christ is supposed to be the Son of God, and so he must be God. But this God has become man, and therefore Jesus sometimes gets angry and sometimes weeps. All that is explained as the human nature of Jesus, because God has become man. But when we speak of the Buddha, we are talking about man becoming God. It's the other way around. man becomes God. And when man has become God, that God never gets angry. The Buddha, we don't speak of the Buddha as becoming angry. And the Buddha never weeps. He is never unhappy. The Buddha is always happy. So you see the difference. We are thinking of a man become God, and we also believe that it is possible for the human being to become God. That means God is one who is perfect in knowledge and perfect in goodness. You see, perfect in knowledge and perfect in goodness. This is what we say when we say Vidya Charana Sampanno. Vidya means knowledge. Charana is the behavior, the goodness, the behavior. Vidya Charana Sampanno. Sugato. Su means good. Gato means arrive at goodness. In other words, become good. Su gato, become good. By purifying the mind. Become good. Now the important thing is that we are devoted to the Buddha means we are devoted to that goal. Buddha becomes our goal. So that is why even though the Buddha is not living today, at least we have a statue to look at the Buddha. And that statue represents the Buddha. After all, even the body of the Buddha was not the real Buddha. It's the mind of the Buddha. And the mind of the Buddha is represented by the body of the Buddha when he was living. But now, instead of the body of the Buddha, we have the statue to represent still the mind of the Buddha. So when we are looking at the statue, the important thing is not that statue, but the mind of the Buddha, which cannot be seen. The mind of the Buddha can only be understood. You can't see the Buddha. This is why the Buddha always said, there was a disciple of the Buddha during the time of the Buddha who was always seated in a place where he could see the Buddha and always sitting near the Buddha and looking at the Buddha. So the Buddha said, why are you looking at this filthy body of mine? If you want to see me, you have to see the Dhamma. He who sees the Dhamma sees me. He who sees the body doesn't really see me. And that is the important thing to understand. That when we think of the Buddha, we are thinking of the mind, but you can't see the mind. You see the mind only through the Dhamma. So when you have understood the Dhamma, you begin to see the mind of the Buddha. So that is very important to understand. And so our devotion to the Buddha is the devotion to the mind of the Buddha. And we will be able to see the mind directly. How? Only when we become a Buddha ourselves. Only when we have become a Buddha ourselves, then we really see the Buddha. Just looking at the body is not looking at the Buddha. So it is very important to reach that state of mind ourselves. Only then we see the Buddha in the real way. So this is very important to understand that devotion means being devoted to the mind of the Buddha, and that becomes the goal that we have to reach. So really seeing the Buddha is to become the Buddha. And that is why the starting point in becoming the Buddha is what is called Sila. Sila is that behavior. Now I told you last time that we are organisms in an environment. Organism is like a machine. And this machine is different from these other machines because we have 5 senses. These other machines don't have these 5 senses. Even the computer is a very highly developed machine, but it doesn't have the 5 senses. Now the environment stimulates the senses. Light falling on the eye, sounds coming to the ears, smells coming to the nose, taste coming to the tongue, and touch coming to the body. In this way, the environment stimulates the organism, and this organism reacts to the stimulus. And the reaction of the organism to the stimulus is perception, or seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. So the organism reacts to the stimulus, and that reaction is what we call perception. Vijnana, and that is today translated as consciousness, which is wrong. Vijnana is not consciousness, Vijnana is perception. But once perception has taken place, the information that you get through that process of perception is carried to the brain through the nerves. Every sense organ has a nerve going to the brain, like the optic nerve, auditory nerve, olfactory nerve, like that. All these nerves go to the brain, and the nerve is like a telephone wire that carries messages to the brain, and once it goes to the brain begins to think. Thinking is the activity of the brain, which is called the cerebrum or the cerebral cortex. That is where the thinking goes on. And that thinking gives meaning to what was seen or heard or smelled or tasted or touched. And because it gives meaning, according to the meaning that is given, there is an emotional reaction. The emotions react to the meaning that is given. You see, now if I say something and you interpret that, the meaning that you give to that is an insult. You are insulting me. Then what happens? You get angry. And getting angry means a message going from the brain to a gland, and the gland secreting a hormone into the blood, and the blood carries this to the whole body when the heart pumps. And then changes take place in the whole body. And so every emotion is a change in the whole body. The activity of the body is changed. That is what an emotion is. So it is a disturbance of the body. The body is disturbed, not just the mind. Mind is doing only the thinking. When you say mind, that now I told you there are words used by the Buddha. That thinking part is what is called mano. And the mano is what interprets what was seen or heard or smelled or tasted or touched. And according to the interpretation, you react emotionally. And when the emotion is aroused in this way, then it is expressed in action, in the form of speech or in the form of action, physical action. Now this is very important to remember always how these emotions come up. I told you that Sigmund Freud thought emotions are built into the system and it is going out from inside out. But here the Buddha points out that these emotions are not going inside out, it is coming from outside in. This is the important thing to understand. And this was discovered later by what are called the cognitive psychologists, who the word cognition is that interpretation or giving meaning. That thinking part is what is called cognition. And it is through that cognition that the emotion is aroused, according to the cognition. The thought that arises in the mind is creating the emotion. This is very important to understand. And this is why the Buddha pointed out that It is because people don't understand this that they are carried away by emotion. And by changing the way you think, changing the way you interpret your circumstances, you can get rid of the emotion. That is what the Buddha achieved. That is how he became a Buddha. How he awakened from the dream of existence. Now that existence is also very important. I told you we are dreaming that we are existing. How does that idea of existence come? From the emotions. This is the important thing to understand. And what is an emotion? Emotion is a reaction to a sensation. There are three kinds of sensations: pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. And that neutral sensation, what does that do? Pleasant sensation you are attracted to. The unpleasant sensation you are repelled by it. But the neutral sensation, what happens? You are not attracted or repelled, but you only think there is something there. There is something there. What is the meaning of is? Is means existence. That is what existence is all about. So these three things, the attraction to pleasure, the hatred of pain, and the idea of existence, that is what is called lobha, dosa, and moha. Lobha refers to the attraction to the pleasant sensation, and dosa refers to the aversion towards the unpleasant sensation, and moha refers to the idea of existence. But when we say exist, it is only just something is existing. But the moment this reaction occurs, another thing happens. When the reaction occurs, the other thing is there is an object to which you react. That means there is an object and there is a reaction. The object is seen as something outside, external to you. And the subject or the subjective experience, which is the desire or the hatred, that is seen as something inside. So you create two things, a subjective and objective. The subjective you personalize. That means you say this is mine. The subjective is mine, the objective is something foreign, outside. You alienate the objective and personalize the subjective. Once you have personalized the subjective, the self comes into being. What you have personalized becomes yourself. So once you personalize, what is it that you call the self? You personalize the subjective, but what is that subjective thing? That subjective thing that you are personalizing is your body, your feelings, whatever you perceive, whatever you think about. You see, you are personalizing these subjective things, and that is what you call yourself. Now that personalizing, I am using this word personalizing, which you never read in the books. Why? That is how I translate the word upadana, which is normally translated as clinging or grasping. This is not clinging and grasping. This is personalizing. Now sometimes when you go to buy a pen, they might say, oh, we can personalize the pen. What does that mean? They write your name on it. So that means it says it belongs to you, this is mine. So to personalize is to say, this is mine. And what is mine becomes yourself. You see, supposing you go and buy a car. So maybe you have a BMW or something with expensive car. When you have that, you begin to feel proud. Why? Why is that? Simply because you have expensive car. Why should you feel proud? Because you have personalized the car, and the car has become yourself. I am big because I have a car. Or you have a big house. You personalize the house, and then you become a big person because you have a big car, big house. You see? Or if you lose this car, what happens to you? Oh, you begin to feel inferior. Why? Because first you were superior, now you lost it. I feel inferior now. Why? Because that object has become yourself. And that object has now disappeared. You see, that personalizing whatever you personalize becomes yourself. That is what has happened.
For a brief intermission, let's indulge in the melodious tunes of the GBs. With their song entitled Standing Together, this song embraces a theme of seeking warmth and togetherness. Here is GBs.
I found the joys within my heart, the joy that fills the bridge. Don't you think that it is time the joy grows and shines? When we stand together, it's the finest hour. We can do almost anything, believing in our aims. Like a bird that flies in an evening sky, take away, oh take away all imaginations and desires to a place where love will shine. When we stand together, it's our finest hour. We can do almost anything, believing in our aims. The first step is to realize that it all begins with you and me, to walk on the Dharma's way, the truth that's so sublime. When we stand together, it's the finest hour. We can do almost anything, believing in our aims. When we stand together, it's the finest hour. We can do almost anything, believing in our aims, believing in our aims, believing in our aims.
Here is a highly profound topic in Buddhism, the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta. In the sacred text, Samyutta Nikaya explains how a wrong view of self develops and how the interaction between this misconception of self and an ever-changing environment leads to continuous suffering. This is part 1. Please listen to the important talks by Bhante Kovida from Toronto, Canada.
The Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, it's about the teaching, the profound teaching of non-self or no permanent self. Because as you know, this teaching of no permanent self, initially it's very challenging, very difficult and challenging. Because very often somebody will say, what do you mean I don't exist? You know, my name is so-and-so, you know, I have a profession, you know, maybe I have a family, you know, I have a house, my address is so-and-so. And I have all these experiences, all personal history. So what do you mean I don't exist? So the important thing to understand is that we all have a self, whether we like it or not. It's a part of our conditioning. Just like we can't avoid learning languages, you know, when you're young. So the conditioning of self, we all have. So even Siddhartha Gautama, you know, Prince Siddhartha Gautama, he also had this conditioning of self. But through great effort and insight, he was able to realize, actually he was the first person who was able to realize the true nature of the self, that it was not something permanent, something which was separate and independent from the rest of nature. It was just a result of social conditioning. So when he began to teach this profound Dharma, I would say most people couldn't understand it, including the monks. Because the belief in a permanent self is such an ancient belief. You know, all the ancient civilizations believed, you know, that this I, the self, the ego, is something permanent. Because, of course, you know, they're stuck in their minds, conditioning and thinking, and they have no practice. So naturally, you believe that this I is something permanent. So when the body dies, which it must, people believe that this seemingly permanent I, self, or some people call it soul, would naturally continue into a new body. Very, very ancient belief. And as you may know, in India, they still believe that. But you can also understand why it gives people comfort, a sense of security, to believe that, after death, I will continue somehow. It's very comforting. So the Buddha tried different methods, different ways of getting people to understand this profound teaching. And one way I mentioned is when we apply mindfulness, present moment awareness, we begin to see the fact of body and mind, physical and mental process. Now, initially, we don't see that because we're social creatures and we use language and we use labels and names, I, you, he, she, and we all have names. But names are really just social labels, so that we can identify each other more easily. But when we don't have the awareness and we have the reflection, we become very attached to labels, and we also become very attached to names also. I know in North America, I see this very strongly. They identify so strongly with their names that if somebody calls them by a wrong name, by mistake, or they forget their names, they get very upset because they take it so personally. Or if you mispronounce their name, maybe they pronounce it in a certain way, and if you pronounce it in another way, they get upset, and they have to correct you. The right pronunciation is like this. So this reflection on the body and the mind was one of the practices that the forest monks did, because they were living a simple life and they could practice. They had the time, because they didn't have a full-time job. They didn't have the responsibility of families and so on. They would just go alms around, pindapat, to the villages and to the nearest town and collected food. So they had time to reflect on this fact of body and mind. And in Pali language, it's called rupa and nama, rupa nama. And it is very profound, but at the same time, it's a very direct teaching. Because when you see body and mind clearly, then it's one of the ways of realizing that there's no permanent self. That is all in the mind, all conditioning, based on thinking and memory and the use of language. And when you're very mindful in daily life, you can see this, the fact of body and mind very, very easily. Because the truth is, we are this process. And we're alive because we're a process. It's very complex, but it is a process. And that's why all our experiences, anything we experience at all, whether it's mental or emotional, or even physical, anything we experience physically, it's always changing, simply because we're a process. Including all our sense experiences, it's always changing. And consciousness is also changing. But when we're not mindful and we don't reflect deeply, we tend to believe that consciousness is something permanent. And this is why many people, even in Buddhist countries, believe that, when we die, of course, there's no permanent I that takes reincarnation or rebirth, but consciousness will continue after death. And it is consciousness that takes rebirth. But when you investigate, you realize it's not possible. Not possible at all. And so, for example, if you're doing mindful breathing, the sensation of the breath, just that natural sensation, you feel the body breathing in, breathing out, rising, falling. That is rupa, the physical. And the awareness of the breathing sensations is mind, or nama. And of course, when you're in the forest, you're very calm, you're very present, so you can see it very easily. There's just body and mind. No permanent I to be found. And initially, it's easier to see body and mind process when we're doing dynamic practice. In other words, when we're moving. For example, when you're doing mindful walking, the feet moving and stepping, that is the physical, rupa. And the awareness of the feet moving and stepping is mind. So you just see body and mind. So in other words, there is no I who is walking. There's only rupa and nama that's walking. Or the body-mind process is walking. And at the same way, if you ask me who is sitting here speaking, it's just body-mind process who is speaking. There's really no Bhante Kovita here. Or let's just say Bhante Kovita is only a social label. And of course, when we get deeper into the elements and the five aggregates, it gives you a different perspective. A perspective that is different from our social world, our conventional world. It's very profound, but it's really wonderful for reflection. And of course, if you're doing the dynamic meditation with the hand movements, you see it very clearly. For example, the hands moving and touching the body, that is rupa, the physical. And the awareness of the hands moving and touching is mind. So you see clearly body and mind, rupa and nama, that's all, only rupa and nama. No permanent I or self. And even when you're eating mindfully, you can see it very clearly. The physical sensation of eating, tasting, chewing, swallowing, that is rupa, the physical. And the awareness of tasting, chewing, swallowing is mind. So anything we do mindfully, you can see it. Likewise, when you're even washing the dishes, you can see body and mind. And if you're washing things by hand, the same thing. Or say if you're sweeping leaves, you can just see just rupa and nama. Just rupa and nama sweeping leaves. So when you have time to really reflect, then it becomes very clear, very, very clear. And this teaching is also very, not only is it profound, but it's direct, and we're able to see conventional reality for what it is. Meaning that all our social labels that we have, and we all have social labels, including our names, they are only human convention. They're not permanent reality. For example, even man, woman are just social labels. But on that deeper level, there's again only body-mind process. You see that? Only body-mind process. And that includes, husband, wife, computer engineer, lawyer, doctor, secretary, you know, whatever your profession is, you just sit at that basic level. Only body-mind process. And that includes, of course, monk, layperson also. Because it helps you to see that if we cling to these social labels as a permanent reality, then it causes us conflict and suffering. And also that includes prime minister also. You see, prime minister is only rupa nama, only physical and mental process. President is the same thing. And the Queen of England, same body-mind process, if you happen to be royalty. And I mentioned before that when I'm in the UK, I like to give this teaching because they have a long history of, you know, titles in that British tradition, a lot of titles, you know, aristocracy, and then you have royalty. And of course, these are the upper class people. And I like to give the teaching because many people, because they are brought up with all these titles and of course royalty, and they become so attached to royalty or the other titles, and they think it's permanent reality. But what the Dhamma is teaching us is that they are only conventional. It's human convention, and they are not permanent. And as you know, Queen Elizabeth, who reigned for what, 70 years? Eventually she had to die. Because we're this body-mind process, we're all subject to sickness, aging, and death. No one can escape that. You know? And it's amazing now to see, you know, King Charles, because he was Prince Charles for so long, right? And then finally, he became king. And I'm sure there was times where he thought, I'll never be king, right? You know, my mother will live forever, right? It's like that. But it's just a social convention. So again, what the Dhamma is telling us, that social conventions are not permanent reality. Sure, we can respect people, you know, with titles, but we can't get too attached to them. And you see, even a dog is the same body-mind process. A cat, same thing. Rupa nama. Even a rat is mental and physical process. Even an ant, a small ant, is the same thing. Rupa nama. I'm not sure about bacteria and viruses, but we can stop at ants. Yeah, it's quite amazing when you see that. But when you do have that understanding, it makes things a little more clear. And you begin to see that reality is much more than our social convention. So then, once you establish that understanding, that we're just a process, and also because we're a process, we have to keep recharging the process, right? The same way that you have to keep recharging your cell phones. We have to, you know, keep drinking and eating. Of course, the body is always breathing, it has to. And of course, we have to exercise to keep this process healthy, right? And when the process gets sick, we have to take medicine. We have to rest. And then, below, a bit deeper than this body-mind process, below Rupa Nama, we have these 5 things, the Sakandas. And in English, they call it the aggregates. But somehow I find the name aggregate a bit strange. That's why I rather say the 5 facts, the 5 factors of experience. So the Alatanakana Sutta focuses mainly on these 5 things, the 5 factors of experience, the 5 skandhas. And I'd like to give a simple example of these 5 things working, because when we first hear or read about these 5 things, they seem a bit complicated. And we don't see how they're related to our daily experience. But when you hear this simple example, then you can relate to it. Because what is interesting is that these 5 things are working all the time, but we're just not aware of them, because they happen very quickly. And to remind you, the 5 factors are the physical body, physical form, which contains all our sense organs, you know, eyes, nose, tongue, ears, and so on. And there's a feeling or sensation. Then we have perception. Then we have mental reaction or mental formation. And we have consciousness. See, it sounds complicated. But once you hear the simple example, then you can relate to it. And I like to clarify what perception is, because sometimes the word perception can be a bit vague. The way we use it in language, it can be a bit vague. But basically, perception is the ability to recognize a sense object. And a simple example of that is, say you're listening to the radio and you hear a song. And if you recognize the song, and sometimes you recognize the singer, the artist, that is perception at work. So not only are you hearing the song, but you recognize it. Which shows you that perception is related to memory, right? From previous experience. And I mentioned before, there are certain smells that you recognize immediately. And a good example is frying garlic, right? Frying garlic, you recognize immediately. And of course, in Southeast Asia, the most famous smell of all is durian. That's right. So if you travel anywhere around the world, away from Malaysia, and you happen to smell durian, you know exactly what it is. That's the power of perception. And I mentioned before too, if you go to these Chinatowns in North America, you know, like San Francisco, Vancouver, Toronto, New York, you get all the fruits from Southeast Asia. You know, durian, rambutan, mangoes. Of course, they have mangoes now. But a lot of white Americans or white Canadians, if they go to Chinatown and see these fruits, they have no idea what they are, because they've never experienced them before. You know, but of course, if you go or I go, you recognize them immediately. So you really see how perception is related to memory and previous experience. Yeah. And a very good example of perception, and you can all relate to the experience, say you're meeting a friend or a family member, say downtown somewhere, you know, in a very busy shopping center, shopping mall, and you're waiting for this friend, and you see so many faces going by. So many coming, going, coming, going. And of course, your friend is late, right? And you're wondering, where is this person? All these faces coming and going. But the moment you see that face, right? The face of a friend or a family member, immediately you recognize them, right? Among hundreds of faces. That's the power of perception. Now, consciousness, as we said, is something always changing. And it's always depending on our sense experience. For example, if you ate something before you came here this evening, part of consciousness included tasting and smelling. But at this moment, you're not tasting or smelling anything, right? So what do we have in consciousness at this moment? Seeing, hearing, and you feel your body sitting, right? Now close your eyes for a moment, and there's no seeing consciousness, but there is still hearing and feeling your body sitting. And of course, if you happen to be thinking, then thinking would be a part of consciousness. But if there's only awareness, then there's no thinking consciousness. And then you open your eyes again, and seeing consciousness arises. So when you open your eyes, seeing consciousness arises again. So that's the nature of consciousness. It's always changing. And later, when you go home, if you have something to eat or drink, then tasting and smelling will arise again. And we mentioned before that tonight when we all go to bed and we fall asleep and we're in the deep sleep state, there is no consciousness. And the deep sleep state usually lasts between 1 to 2 hours, depending on the individual. And for young children, the deep sleep state is a bit longer for young children. But for adults, it's between 1 to 2 hours. There's absolutely no consciousness. And you're not even aware of your house. You're not aware of your family, your friends, even your job. And Malaysia does not exist in deep sleep state. Very interesting. Even your bedroom does not exist. But say, you have to wake up in the night. The moment you wake up, of course, you're aware of your bedroom, right? But if you're in deep sleep, you're not aware of it. Very interesting. And this is why there's an old saying, when somebody's in deep sleep state and they're not aware of anything, we say that person is dead to the world. It's an old saying. Meaning that person is just not aware of anything. There's just no consciousness. And maybe you've had that experience where, say, you're listening to some music, say a CD, and then you fall asleep. And later you wake up, and there's no more music playing. I'm sure you've had that experience. It means that while you were conscious, you could hear the music, but the moment you fell asleep, no more hearing. Although the music continued for a while, but there's no hearing consciousness. It's like that. And if you're wondering about the dream state, when the brain comes out of that deep sleep state, then the thought process starts up again. It's in the frontal lobe of the brain. And we call it the dream state. And if you observe your dreams, or you quickly write them down before you forget them, you see that dreams are really just all our memories all mixed up. Maybe you've noticed that. They're all mixed up. And sometimes, there's some fantasy. And sometimes, an anxiety will arise in your dream, those anxious dreams. Of course, there's always scary dreams. And you find to that if you have some important appointment or some important event coming up, it's very likely you'll dream about it. Or say you're taking a trip somewhere and you're excited about it, very often you'll dream about it. I wonder if you've noticed that. And if you're taking a trip, very often you'll dream, that you're trying to get to the airport, but somehow you're getting delayed, or something is preventing you from getting to the airport, and you finally get to the airport and you've missed your flight. But then you wake up and you say, oh, thank God, thank goodness, it's only a dream. And I'm sure you have those dreams where you're in serious trouble. And you think, this is it now, this is it. And then you wake up and you're happy that it's only a dream. And then there are those special dreams where something wonderful is about to take place, and then you wake up. And you wish, you were still dreaming. So the simple example I like to give is you're taking a walk in a forest or a bush somewhere. Of course, your physical body is involved with all your sense organs, and you hear a sound. You look towards the sound, and your eyes see an object. So from hearing consciousness, seeing consciousness, and you see this object, and with perception, you recognize that object as a frog or a snake. Okay? From that perception, that recognition, comes a feeling or sensation. If you happen to like frogs or snakes, most likely it's a very pleasant feeling, right? You're happy to see the frog or the snake. On the other hand, if you don't like frogs or snakes, the opposite happens. Ooh, aversion, fear, anxiety. I have a feeling most of you would have aversion to the frog or the snake. So if it's a pleasant experience, pleasant sensation, you might decide to just stop and just watch. Watch the frog hopping or the snake slithering. That's a tricky word to say, especially when you're tired or sleepy. Slithering. But you're fascinated because there's no aversion, right? There's no fear. And you might even decide, oh, I want to play with them. And if you don't want to touch them, you might get a twig or a little stick, and you just play with them. Because there's no fear, no aversion. On the other hand, if you're scared, there's aversion, then your mental reaction would be to get the hell out of there, right? You walk away very quickly, and in some cases, you run. So that's a simple example of these 5 things working. First, you hear something, then you see something, then you recognize that thing, out of which arises your feeling, sensation, and then your mental reaction would depend on whether it's pleasant or unpleasant. And what the Dhamma is showing us is that these 5 things, they work very quickly, and they're impermanent. And there's no permanent I, no permanent self to be found in these 5 things. And they are interdependent, interconnected. Meaning that they work together. And also, what the Dhamma is teaching us is that when we cling to any of these 5 things, the body, we cling to it as self. If we cling to a feeling or sensation as a self, if we cling to any of these 5 things as self, me and mine, there is some form of dukkha, mental, emotional suffering. If we cling to our perceptions, if we cling to even our mental reaction, that is also a source of dukkha and conflict. And of course, when we cling to consciousness itself, to the senses, we also have conflict. I remember, a group of kids, say they're walking somewhere, say in the bush or the forest, and something moves suddenly in the forest. And each person will interpret what they see in a different way. Some people might say it's a rabbit. Some people might say it's a snake. Or it's another kind of animal. And of course, they start to argue. Who's right, who's wrong. But if you have wisdom, you won't argue. But you acknowledge, yes, something moved in the bush, but you won't argue and you won't cling to it, that my perception is correct. You understand? And your perception is wrong. Yeah, it's like that. Yeah, so the Dhamma is saying that if we cling to any of these 5 things, then there is some kind of dukkha and conflict. And of course, if we cling to the body, the physical form, as a self or something permanent, of course, there is suffering. And that's why the Dhamma said we have to understand that this body or this body-mind process, it doesn't really belong to us. It's not a personal possession. It really belongs to the changing conditions of nature. And of course, we have to take care of it as best as we can, but we can't cling to it. It's the same way as, say, if you're renting a house or an apartment, you still have to look after it, although it doesn't belong to you, officially. But even if your house or your apartment belongs to you, you're finally able to pay for it. So officially, legally, it's yours, but it's still a temporary shelter. We still have to leave it one day. Whether it's a small place or is it a big mansion, we still have to leave it. And the same with feelings or feeling sensations. We can't cling to it, because whatever we experience is always changing, simply because we're this process. We always have to come back to that reality of rupa and nama. For example, in Theravada countries, the Buddha statue is often referred to as a Buddha Rupa. Buddha Rupa, meaning a physical symbol or representation of the Buddha. That's all it means. Buddha Rupa, a Buddha statue. But of course, the real Buddha is in our minds. I always say the living Buddha. The living Buddha is actually in our minds. The awareness and the knowing. Awareness and the knowing. And it's very important to understand, when we reflect on these 5 factors, to keep reminding ourselves that they are interdependent and interconnected. Very important. Why? Because many people believe that when we die, that consciousness continues after death. But when you understand that these 5 factors are interdependent, interconnected, you realize you cannot separate consciousness from the other 4 factors. Because they work together, right? So in the same way, we cannot separate our nose from our face, because our nose is a part of our face. You can only separate your nose from your face if you do it surgically. But otherwise, you can't separate it. Just like you can't separate your eyes or your eyebrows or your chin, your forehead, from the rest of your face. So why do we do that? Why do we separate consciousness? Because for one thing, we are trapped in thinking. We don't have the awareness. And secondly, it's just wishful thinking. Because when we're trapped in thinking without any understanding, we want something to continue after death. It's very natural. And one of the insights you get when you understand the nature of thinking is that thinking is very limited. Thinking can only see things in isolation, things in fragments. Thinking cannot see the whole, how things are interconnected, interdependent. And this is why when you really calm the mind and you really reflect deeply, then you begin to see that life is a very, very complex web. You know, like a spider's web, very complex web of interrelationships, interconnectedness. It's extremely, extremely complex. But you know, when you're busy with your life and work and family, you cannot see it. It takes time and it takes effort. Extremely complex. For example, in Sri Lanka, you know, they believe in rebirth, you know. And I have a good friend, a monk, and one day we were discussing this thing of rebirth, and he believes that, you know, when we die, rebirth goes up to the Deva realm, because he thinks it's permanent, that consciousness is something permanent. So consciousness goes up into the Deva realm, you know, and it hangs out there for some time, and then it comes down and it takes rebirth into a human body. But that, of course, is only a belief. So I said to him, when you're retired from teaching, you know, go to a meditation center and you practice. And you investigate, and you see that consciousness is not permanent. But, you know, people have all these beliefs. Just like Ajahn Chah, you know, the famous forest monk? Because, you know, the last 10 years of his life, he was unable to speak. But because he was such a, you know, recognized teacher, the Thai people, they like to believe that although he couldn't teach in the human realm, he was teaching in the Deva realm. Again, it's wishful thinking. But, you know, if it gives people some comfort, then why not? You know, as long as you're not harming anyone or forcing other people to believe what you believe. And the people who believe in the traditional rebirth, you have the freedom to believe whatever you want. But the most important thing is present moment awareness and knowing. Because it's only with present moment awareness and knowing that we're able to deal with dukkha, mental, emotional suffering and conflict. Because after a while you begin to see that beliefs are not so important. But again, we cling to them because it gives us comfort. And especially regarding the great mystery of death and the unknown. So when we go deeper than these 5 things, these 5 factors of experience, we have the 32 body parts. I'm sure you can find a list of them somewhere. And then you go a bit deeper, and we have the 6 elements. And I usually like to do the reflection on the 6 elements because when we read or hear about these elements, you know, that we're composed of these elements, it's only a concept, only an idea. But when you reflect on them on a regular basis, then the truth of the elements becomes very real. And you realize that we exist because of these elements. And we mentioned before, when we reflect on the truth of these elements on a regular basis, you get to a stage where you realize that we're just a collection of elements pretending to be people. Just imagine, we're just pretending. And my collection of elements sitting here is only pretending to be Bhante Kovida from Canada. And your collection of elements is pretending to be who you are, or who you think you are. Because in the end, it's all pretending. It's all pretending. And if you really want to know what continues after death, you know, I call it the $1 million question, because people have been asking this question for centuries and centuries. You know, what continues after death? You know, what happens to me when I die? What continues after death? It's the elements. The elements go back to nature. But there's no aspect of self, of the self, that continues. Of course, some people will disagree, but that's okay. But really, it's the elements that go back to nature. Do we have time to do the reflection on the elements? Huh? Yeah, we might as well do it. Yeah, some of you have heard this reflection before. But I don't think you've heard the elements, yeah.
No, but the elements, but not.
That's right. And also very often when teachers speak about the elements, they speak about it in a very academic way. So it's still a bit vague or, you know, conceptual. Because I think a lot of people who teach or share the Dhamma, they're only getting the information, the knowledge, just from books. Okay, so very quickly, just feel the hair on your head. Feel the hair on your head. Just feel it. Is there shampoo or is there conditioning? So the hair, of course, is related to the earth element, right? Earth element. And if you feel the nails on your fingers, just feel the hard quality. That's also earth element. And for the hair and the nails to grow, the water element is involved. The water element is involved. And while you're feeling the nails, you can just feel the bones in your fingers. Just feel the hard quality of the bones. You have calcium, magnesium there. And inside you have water, you have heat. And if you feel your knees, the bones in your knees, because they're bigger bones, right? You just feel the bigger bones in your knees. Again, calcium, magnesium, earth element. And inside the bones, you have water element and you have heat, heat element there. And then just run your tongue over your teeth, which is very easy to do. And just feel the hard quality of the teeth. Again, you have calcium, magnesium in the teeth, earth element. And then at the same time, you can feel the wetness in the mouth, saliva. So that's water, water element. Then think of tears from the eyes. You have the water element. And if you taste your tears, you usually taste salt, right? Salt. And salt is an earth element. But in this case, it's dissolved. Right? So it's not hard like the bones, it's just dissolved. The same as sweat or perspiration, right? You have the water element, you have salt. And then you have urine or pee, which is a part of our daily experience. You have water element, you have salt, earth element, other minerals also. And if pee is fresh, it feels warm because it's coming directly from the body. So there's heat there, the heat element. And then we come to blood. You have the water element, then you have salt, minerals, and iron, the hemoglobin. So the earth element is quite prominent in blood. Salt, minerals, and iron. Then you have the heat element, of course, and then you have oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen. So the air element is also prominent in blood, just like the earth element. And the reason why we have the heat element is because we are this process, the process of body and mind. And so we have, what do you call it, metabolism, right? Metabolism, because the process produces heat. And that's why, when we get physically active, right, we feel warm or hot sometimes, and the body perspires as a natural way of cooling the system down. And then when we breathe mindfully, you're in direct contact with the air element, right? Sometimes it's referred to as the wind element, air or wind. And at the same time, we can experience the element of space. We can feel the space in the lungs as we breathe. And space is an element because there's space inside the body and there's space outside the body. Now just touch the hand, the back of your hand. We have the earth element, water element, heat element, and air. The four elements are there. And if you feel your neck, usually the neck area feels a little warmer, right? It's a bit warmer here. And of course, when we're having a fever, the heat element goes up. And as you know, when the fever gets too high, we need medical attention, all right? When it gets too high. So below the skin, you have, flesh, muscles, sinew, so many different body parts inside, and of course we have the internal organs. We have the earth, water, heat, and the air.
We have already given a brief introduction to the Jataka stories. They are a collection of stories, a very few previous existence of the Buddha, then known as Bodhisattva, one who's striving hard to serve all beings selflessly. These stories are excellent source of motivation that leads us on the right direction. Please encourage your children and adults as well to read these stories and watch these programs. They will surely guide them in the right direction for their success. Now, here is Kuttavanji Jataka Stories.
กูตวานิชชาดก ชาดกว่าด้วยหนามยอกเอาหนามบ่ง พ่อค้า2 คนในเมืองสาวัตถีร่วมทุนกันทำการค้าคุมขบวนเกวียนสินค้าไปสู่ชนบทเมื่อค้าขายจนหมดแล้วก็เดินทางกลับบ้านเมื่อกลับถึงเมืองสาวัตถีแทนที่จะได้ทำการตกลงแบ่งทรัพย์อันเกิดจากการค้าขายพ่อค้าคนหนึ่งเกิดคิดไม่ซื่อคิดโกงเอาทรัพย์ทั้งหมดมาเป็นของตนเองจึงคิดอุบายนำอาหารมาเลี้ยงสหายพ่อค้าอีกคนและลูกขบวนทั้งหมด
เอาเลยเชิญกินกันตามสบายเลยนะพวกเราเหนื่อยยากกันมาตั้งนานละ
สหายเอ๋ยตอนนี้พวกเราก็ค้าขายจบสิ้นแล้วนำทรัพย์ที่ได้มาแบ่งกันเถิด
โอ้ยเจ้าจะรีบแบ่งไปทำไมกันนี่ชิมนี่ซะก่อนอาหารเนี่ยลดเลิศอย่าบอกใคร อาหารมีตั้งเยอะแยะเจ้าอย่าคิดแต่เรื่องแบ่งทรัพย์เลยเอาไว้ทีหลังเถิด
พ่อค้าโกงบ่ายเบี่ยงที่จะแบ่งทรัพย์ทุกครั้งที่พ่อค้าสหายถามถึงเขาจัดอาหารรสเลิศและจัดสถานที่นอนให้กับสหายอย่างดีเยี่ยมเพราะคิดว่าพ่อค้าผู้เป็นสหายของเขาตรากตรำในการค้าขายมาหลายวันการกินไม่ดีการนอนก็ลำบากหากเขาจัดโภชนะดีๆด้วยรสเลิศต่างๆในเรือนของเขาจนพอใจพ่อค้าผู้เป็นสหายก็จะตายด้วยโรคอาหารไม่ย่อย
กินอิ่มแล้วนอนหลับปุ๋ยอย่างนี้ไม่พ้นเดือนแน่ๆ แล้วทรัพย์ที่เราก็จะแบ่งออกเป็น3 ส่วนของเด็กๆส่วนหนึ่งแล้วที่เหลือ2 ส่วนก็เป็นของเรา
วันแล้ววันเล่าผ่านไปแม้พ่อค้าผู้เป็นสหายจะถามถึงส่วนแบ่งสักกี่ครั้งแต่ละครั้งก็ถูกพ่อค้าโกงบ่ายเบี่ยงทุกครั้งไปแต่เขาก็ไม่ใช่คนโง่ที่จะปล่อยให้พ่อค้าโกงหลอกเอาได้ครั้งหนึ่งจึงคาดคั้นให้แบ่งจนได้
เจ้าจะรีบแบ่งไปทำไมกันอยู่ที่นี่ให้สบายก่อนเถิดอาหารการกินก็ดีจะนอนก็สบายทรัพย์มันไม่บูดเสียหรอกแบ่งกันตอนไหนก็ได้
สหายเอ๋ยบัดนี้เราลิ้มรสอาหารจนเบื่อแล้วเจ้าอย่าบ่ายเบี่ยงอีกเลยแบ่งทรัพย์ของข้ามาเถิดยังไงวันนี้เราก็ต้องเอาทรัพย์ในส่วนของเราให้ได้
เมื่อแบ่งทรัพย์กันแล้วพ่อค้าผู้เป็นบัณฑิตก็ไปสู่พระวิหารถวายบังคมพระศาสดาได้รับปฏิสันถานที่ทรงกระทำเมื่อพระผู้มีพระภาคเจ้ารับสั่งถามว่าเหตุใดจึงมาเข้าเฝ้าพระองค์ช้านักพ่อค้าบัณฑิตจึงกราบทูลเรื่องทั้งหมดแด่พระผู้มีพระภาคเจ้าให้ทรงทราบดูก่อนอุบาสกมิใช่แต่ในบัดนี้เท่านั้นที่นายพาณิชย์นั้นเป็นพาณิชย์โกงแม้ในการก่อนก็เคยเป็นพาณิชย์โกงมาแล้วเหมือนกันแต่ในครั้งนี้มุ่งจะล่วงท่านแม้ในครั้งก่อนก็ไม่อาจจะหลอกลวงบัณฑิตได้เมื่ออุบาสกกราบทูลอาราธนาแล้วจึงทรงนำเอาเรื่องในอดีตมาสาธกดังต่อไปนี้ เมื่อการก่อนในเมืองพาราณสีมีพ่อค้าชื่อว่าบัณฑิตได้เข้าหุ้นทำการค้ากับพ่อค้าผู้เป็นสหายชื่อว่าอติบัณฑิตเขาทั้งสองชวนกันบรรทุกสินค้าด้วยเกวียน500 เล่มไปขายที่ชายแดนแห่งหนึ่งได้กำไรกลับมาอย่างงามเมื่อค้าขายเสร็จสิ้นและได้เดินทางมาถึงบ้านแล้วก็ถึงเวลาแบ่งเงินตามที่ได้ตกลงกันในครั้งแรก
มาเถิดสหายเราเอาทรัพย์ที่ได้มาแบ่งกันเถิดกำไรครั้งเนี้ยงามนักส่วนแบ่งของเราคงได้มากโขอยู่
ใช่เราควรจะได้2 ส่วนส่วนเจ้าเอาไป1 ส่วน
ทำไมล่ะเพราะเหตุใดเจ้าจึงได้ถึง2 ส่วนเหตุใดเราถึงได้ไม่เท่ากันล่ะ
ก็เพราะเจ้าชื่อบัณฑิตเฉยๆควรได้ส่วนเดียวส่วนเราชื่ออติบัณฑิตก็ควรจะได้2 ส่วน
จะพูดอย่างนั้นก็ไม่ถูกถึงทุนรอนและพาหนะขนของเรา2 คนก็ออกเท่าๆกันแล้วเวลาแบ่งกำไรทำไมถึงได้ไม่เท่ากันล่ะข้าไม่เข้าใจ
เจ้าจะให้เราอธิบายสักกี่ทีเนี่ยก็บอกแล้วไงว่าเป็นเพราะชื่อยังไงก็แล้วแต่เจ้าควรจะได้รับแค่ส่วนเดียวเท่านั้นแหละแต่หากเจ้าจะดึงดันแบ่งเท่ากันแล้วก็เพื่อความเป็นธรรมเรามาหาคนกลางตัดสินกันดีกว่า
เมื่อทั้งสองตกลงกันไม่ได้พ่อค้าอติบัณฑิตจึงเสนอให้รุกขเทวดาที่สถิตอยู่ต้นไม้ใหญ่ในป่าให้เป็นผู้ตัดสินซึ่งนั่นก็เป็นอีกแผนที่เขาได้วางไว้เพื่อโกงเอาทรัพย์ของพ่อค้าผู้เป็นสหายเช่นกัน
พ่อพรุ่งนี้ท่านจงไปแอบอยู่ใต้โพรงไม้ใหญ่นั้นเถิดช่วยปลอมเป็นรุกขเทวดาให้ลูกด้วยลูกได้นัดหมายให้สหายไปพบรุกขเทวดาเพื่อขอให้ตัดสินส่วนแบ่งให้แล้ว
ได้สิลูกเอ๋ยอะไรที่ทำให้เจ้าได้ส่วนแบ่งมากขึ้นพ่อก็ยินดีทำให้งานนี้สบายมากอยู่แล้วยังไงเจ้าบัณฑิตนั่นก็คงไม่รู้แผนของเราหรอก
ใช่จ้ะ แล้วเราก็จะได้ส่วนแบ่งตั้ง2 ส่วนน่ะทีนี้ไม่ว่าพ่อจะปรารถนาสิ่งใดข้าก็จะหามาให้
ดีพ่ออยากจะได้ผ้าดีๆสักผืนไว้ใส่ไปงานบุญอยู่แล้ว
โอ้ยแค่นี้จิ๊บจ้อยนะพ่อถ้าแผนสำเร็จจริงๆเดี๋ยวลูกจัดให้สัก5 ชุดเป็นยังไงล่ะ
รุ่งขึ้นเมื่อถึงเวลานัดหมายพ่อค้าทั้งสองก็ออกเดินทางไปต้นไม้ใหญ่แห่งหนึ่งที่ท้ายหมู่บ้านที่พ่อค้าอติบัณฑิตได้นัดแนะให้พ่อของตนไปแอบอยู่
อุ๊ยใกล้ถึงเวลาแล้วต้องรีบซ่อนดีนะที่บทไม่ยาวมากไม่งั้นข้าจำไม่ได้แน่เลยความจำยิ่งสั้นอยู่ด้วยเนี่ย
เมื่อพ่อค้าทั้งสองเดินมาถึงต้นไม้ใหญ่ก็จุดธูปกราบไหว้ขอให้รุกขเทวดาช่วยตัดสินปัญหาให้
พวกเจ้ามีเรื่องอะไรให้เราช่วยตัดสินเหรอสีหน้าพวกเจ้านี่เคร่งเครียดนัก
ท่านรุกขเทวดาเรื่องมันมีอยู่ว่าเราทั้ง2 คนได้ร่วมทุนกันทำการค้าขายโดยทั้งพาหนะและลูกหาบเรา2 คนก็มีเท่าๆกันเมื่อค้าขายได้กำไรกลับมาแล้วท่านรุกขเทวดาเห็นว่าเราควรจะแบ่งกันเช่นไรถึงจะยุติธรรม
ผมกับสหายตกลงกันไม่ได้สักทีจริงๆแล้วผมมีชื่ออติบัณฑิตส่วนสหายผมชื่อบัณฑิตการแบ่งทรัพย์ผมก็น่าจะได้ส่วนแบ่ง2 ส่วนส่วนสหายผมชื่อบัณฑิตเฉยๆก็น่าจะได้แค่ส่วนเดียวเท่านั้นท่านรุกขเทวดาว่าถูกไหมขอรับ
จากที่ได้ฟังเจ้าทั้ง2เล่ามาเนี่ยนะพ่อค้าที่ชื่ออติบัณฑิตควรได้2 ส่วนจริงส่วนพ่อค้าที่ชื่อบัณฑิตนะควรได้แค่ส่วนเดียวเท่านั้น
นั่นไงล่ะข้าว่าแล้วเชียวว่าที่ข้าพูดมันต้องถูกเห็นไหมสหายบัณฑิตเจ้าควรได้ส่วนแบ่งแค่ส่วนเดียวจริงๆด้วย
นายบัณฑิตนั้นไม่ใช่คนโง่เขาสังเกตเห็นพิรุธหลายอย่างจึงคิดพิสูจน์ว่ารุกขเทวดาที่ต้นไม้นั้นมีอยู่จริงหรือไม่
สหายจะให้เราเชื่อเช่นนั้นก็ได้แต่เราขอพิสูจน์ให้แน่ใจก่อนนะ
นายบัณฑิตเดินไปเก็บฟืนแล้วนำมากองกันไว้โคนต้นไม้จุดไฟเผาในโพรงไม้นั้น
เดี๋ยวเธอจะได้รู้กันว่าเทวดาจริงหรือเทวดาปลอมกันแน่
เมื่อฟืนติดไฟก็ลุกลามเข้าไปในโพรง ควันลอยพุ่งขึ้น
โอ้ยร้อนจังทำไงดีล่ะโอ้ยอันนี้ไม่ได้อยู่ในแผนนี่นะโอ้ยทนไม่ไหวแล้วโอ้ยร้อนโอ้ย
พ่อของนายอติบัณฑิตที่แอบอยู่ในโพรงก็สำลักควันรีบหนีตายออกมาจากโพรงไม้แทบไม่ทันเนื้อตัวดำสกปรกหน้าตลก
โอ้ยร้อนจนทนไม่ไหวแล้วเนี่ยโอ้ยจะเผากายตายอยู่ในนั้นหรือไงโอ้ยร้อนจนเกือบถูกเผาแล้วสิเราโอ้ยทนไม่ไหวแล้วโอ้ยร้อนโอ้ยร้อน
ไหนล่ะ รุกขเทวดาที่เจ้าว่าข้าเห็นแต่พ่อของเจ้ามิใช่หรือเจ้าอย่าได้คิดโกงอีกเลยแบ่งให้เท่ากันเถอะ
โอ้ยพ่อนะพ่อเสียแผนหมด
แล้วคนทั้งสองนั้นต่างก็แบ่งทรัพย์กันคนละครึ่งถือเอาส่วนเท่ากันแล้วต่างก็ไปตามยถากรรมพระศาสดาทรงนำเอาเรื่องในอดีตนี้มาสาธกว่าแม้ในครั้งก่อนพาณิชย์นั้นก็เป็นนายพาณิชย์โกงเหมือนกันแล้วทรงประชุมชาดกว่าพ่อค้าโกงในครั้งนั้นได้มาเป็นพ่อค้าโกงในปัจจุบันนี้แหละส่วนพ่อค้าผู้เป็นบัณฑิตได้เสวยพระชาติเป็นองค์พระสัมมาสัมพุทธเจ้าพระคาถาประจำชาดกสาธุโขปันทิโตนามะนะเตวะอติปันทิโตอติปันทิเตนะปุตเตนะมนัมหิอุปกุตทิโตคนที่ชื่อบัณฑิตดีแน่ส่วนคนที่ชื่อว่าอติบัณฑิตไม่ดีเลยเพราะว่าเจ้าอติบัณฑิตลูกเราเกือบเผาเราเสียแล้ว
That concludes our broadcasting. If you have any concerns or questions, please don't hesitate to contact us at info@buddhadharmatv.com. Thank you for watching, and we're confident that our program on the Buddha Dharma TV will inspire peace lovers around the world. Good night. See you tomorrow at the same time. Namo Buddhaya.